I'm Diane Sayre, and Dennis Speed will be our featured speaker today for the Saturday Manhattan LaRouche PAC Town Hall meeting. Today is Saturday, October 19th, 2019. And what we'll be talking about is actually a question that was near and dear to Mr. LaRouche's heart, which is the subject of metaphor, which has become very clear to me in the last weeks why Lyndon LaRouche brought this up so frequently, because especially in a super fast-paced, fast-moving situation like you have today, which is global in nature, and the developments are coming at a fast and furious rate, and you can cover any thread from developments of China and the Belt and Road, the witch hunt against President Trump, the infighting among Democratic Party candidates, the collapse of the economy. You can obsess about getting every detail right and having the so-called facts, and many people make it a point to bludgeon each other with their facts. But somehow, once you have all the facts, you're left still not having a sense that you actually understand what is going on strategically. And that this gets, in a sense, to the question of metaphor and also the question of dynamics, because the question of truth, like the question of an idea or an hypothesis, is not something that you can hold in your hand or touch or smell or taste. But the best that someone can do, a truly poetic speaker like Abraham Lincoln or Martin Luther King or Kennedy's Rice University speech, you can think of some of these. What these speakers have the ability to do is to create a shadow or a footprint which causes a full idea to emerge in the individual mind of the audience or the person who is hearing it. But the idea itself is not in any of the particular words or facts. And I think we've really lost that today if you think about what happened when we had the intervention against Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez with the Eat the Babies. How many people were confused and didn't know if this was real or not? And I ran into it again yesterday, and people said, and I said, no, we did that. Oh, yeah. And then they would start laughing. But it hadn't been funny at the time. Now, of course, you could say there's reason for some confusion, because if you saw Greta Thunberg at the United Nations, that 16-year-old sounded like a raving lunatic. She was completely impassioned, and the things that she was saying was crazy. So there could be a question in today's world whether something like that were serious or not. Or what I saw of the Copenhagen summit with Al Gore and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, where I really was shocked that you have people who are nominal grown-ups sitting in a room hearing Al Gore say that the amount of pollution that we're putting into the air is the equivalent of 500,000 Hiroshimas. And it's no wonder that children are terrified, because if you have people who call themselves leaders saying things like this, that would be pretty scary. And then AOC said very seriously that by the year 2080, every single airport in the New York metropolitan area is going to be under the ocean. Again, it is amazing. So perhaps there's a question, but this is the destruction. Now, what I think is very important for people to understand who we are intersecting and organizing in this fight to defend the Trump presidency is, unless we completely crush the British Empire, the intelligence agencies, the full apparatus that is running this thing, it cannot end. And the reason it cannot end is because their financial system, the transatlantic banking and financial system, is headed for the greatest collapse that has ever happened in modern history. Maybe the collapse that led to the Black Death in Europe in the 1300s was comparable. But if you look at what's happening right now, since the bailout of 2008, and that was not the beginning. You could go back, Helga goes back to 1971 when President Nixon took the dollar off gold. You had an earlier assault, which was beginning in 1966-67 when the space program was cut. Before we even landed on the moon, the last 3 Apollo missions, 18, 19, and 20, which were supposed to have occurred, were eliminated from the budget. And you began to get, as Lyndon LaRouche has drawn, people have seen that triple curve function that looks like a trumpet bell, with a curve going up hyperbolically, which is financial aggregates and monetary aggregates, a curve going down hyperbolically. Prior to 1966, this was one curve. That is, you invested in something productive, it was reflected in a growth of the stock market, it was reflected in an increase in liquidity and currency and circulation and a standard of living. But once you decided to allow arbitrary financial instruments with no relationship to the physical productive base, then what occurred was an inverse proportion, where the more money you have in the stock market, the more money you have sloshing around, the lower the standard of living becomes. And that leads to, as you know, how hyperbolic curves, it's a shock front, leads to a crash. So what's happened, as we've discussed, is since September 17th, the Federal Reserve every night has been having to pump anywhere from $37 billion to $75 to $83 billion into the repo, the bank overnight lending operations. Because at that time, the banks suddenly lost confidence in each other. So interest rates, which would have been at 2%, suddenly went to 10%. And at that point, all interbank lending would freeze. And the Federal Reserve couldn't allow that, so they stepped in. The public is not allowed to know which of the mega banks the other banks have lost confidence in. But it means, as we have been discussing, that there are zombie banks out there, and perhaps some of us will be zombie banks for Halloween. And which one it is, we don't know, although J.P. Morgan Chase has been indicted in a RICO suit. That maybe is it J.P. Morgan, is it Bank of America, is it Citigroup, is it, well, maybe it's all of them. But they know something that the general public doesn't know, and they are not willing to lend to each other. So the Federal Reserve has stepped in to do it. So that should tell you something. Now, it also is the case that President Trump, who spoke about reinstating the Glass-Steagall Act before he was elected, he may not be inclined to do what Bush and Obama did. That is to bail out a corrupt criminal system run by people like Jeffrey Epstein, and crush the working American population. For example, if you decide to do what LaRouche says in his 4 laws, after reinstating Glass-Steagall, establishing a national bank as opposed to the Federal Reserve, and a credit system, what is your credit going to go for? It's going to go for things like the Artemis mission, like the space program, which are drivers, which cost a certain amount of money, but the return that you get is an order of magnitude. It's at least 10 to 1, and I would argue even higher, because if you think about what we got from the space program, we're still using cell phones, microwaves, Teflon, Velcro. So the idea of measuring what was the return that we got. And you have people with these silly arguments. Why don't we spend the money here on Earth? Well, when you go to the moon, what's the bank on the moon? Are we spending money on the moon? I don't think so. The money is spent on Earth, and it's spent employing and developing and training people to do this. So that is the kind of thing that would transform the whole society. I just wanted to show this. Someone brought it in. It's the Tsingtao newspaper, which I guess is from Hong Kong. It's a Chinese language, Chinese community paper. And you may not be able to see it from there. These are the 2 astronauts, Christina Koch and Jessica Mayer, who did the first all-female 7-hour spacewalk repairing a power cable on the space station. Now, this is how they cover it. It's an entire front page. Is that the front page of the New York Times? Is that the front page of the Wall Street Journal? How about the New York Daily News? I haven't seen it, but I suspect not. So think about what people are allowed to consider is important by the mainstream press. And what Helga Zepp-LaRouche had discussed with us recently is that, because we brought up the question of what's happened in Syria, and I'm going to show you just 8 minutes of a video interview with a very dear correspondent of ours, Hussein Askari, who is Iraqi-Swedish, but it turns out, and he'll go through it, actually grew up in the Kurdish part of Iraq, on the incredible potential of what's happening in Syria, actually, with what President Trump has done. And I'll ask you to consider the irony, because partly people don't see this, again, because of this question of metaphor, the question of classical drama. Why did Abraham Lincoln spend so much time reading Shakespeare with his soldiers? Because when you get to intense battles of the future of mankind, it's not simple. It's complex. And there's ironies, and there's moments, and there's things that can develop in a way that you totally don't expect. And these factors depend on human creativity, not the physical terrain. How many battles have been won not by the person who had the superior forces? And how is it that someone with an inferior, smaller materiel, less money, less troops, wins a battle? Why would they win a war? It's a question of an intent, and it's a question of an insight. And I think you can look at what we're hearing today. There's a couple different approaches on Syria. One is, yes, it's really great. It's tremendous that Trump is getting our troops out of there. Very good. And, well, whatever happens to the Kurds, too bad for them. But at least our troops are coming home. That might be the best. Then you have the screamers, right? No, we should stay there forever. We should defend the Kurds, just like we should have defended the people that Assad supposedly gassed, except he didn't gas them. But we have to stay there forever. It's up to us, etc. These are all wrong. What's actually come into being is something completely different, which is the potential, the first step in a potential for the entire region to be stabilized and developed. And nobody's talking about that at all, and people don't know the complexities. So I want you to just hear it from Hussein directly to get a sense of this, and then Dennis will be speaking.
Thank you, Matt, for inviting me. It's a great pleasure and honor for me to be on this great show. Yes, I agree with Senator Richard Black's assessment that this potentially could become an outbreak of peace in the region, but also potentially for global peace. Now, for people to hear that in the middle of a so-called military operation is very strange, but to understand the situation and to understand what I'm going to say now in this show, people need to have a sober mind, a mind which is not affected by the emotions created and provoked by the mainstream media reporting about anything in the world. That's the effect of it. That's the purpose of it, is to make people think with their emotions rather than with their minds. And my advice to your audience is that in order to come into that sober state of mind, I would recommend that people listen to Mozart's Piano Sonata number 11, which ends with the Turkish March, which I did actually when I saw these developments, because you need to understand irony, because this Turkish March, like in Mozart's piece, the Turkish military incursion into might potentially and ironically lead to a major settlement of the situation in the region. So I want people to look at this with a completely fresh eyes, but also with the knowledge and the experience we have had working also for many years with Mr. Lyndon LaRouche, of the Helga Sepp LaRouche, and the other associates of the LaRouche movement and Schiller Institute, that there is a new way of looking at things to be able to understand the general strategic context for what is happening and how we go from here. So in that sense, I think President Trump and President of Russia, Vladimir Putin, each from his side, kicked the grand chessboard of geopolitics, the grand chessboard of Zbigniew Brzezinski, of Samuel Huntington, and their British masters, which has dominated world politics for a very long time. Now, the decision to withdraw from Syria was correct, but that, I believe, was a masterfully orchestrated move in cooperation, directly or indirectly, with the Russian side. We do know that the Russian military was involved in direct contact with the US military, both before and during the withdrawal, and they are still continuing to do that. So that has been in the works for a very long time. People have a very short memory. President Trump already last December announced that he is intending to withdraw US troops from Syria. And since then, the Syrians, the Russians, the Kurds have been involved in negotiations, what to do if that happens. And I think the irony here also is that President Erdogan has also changed in the process of what these developments in the past 3 years. But in order to put the whole irony in the context is, I want to show you a video because funny enough, when President Trump announced the immediate withdrawal and this military operation started, I was in the Turkish capital, Istanbul, for a tourist visit. So you may watch this video with me. Hello, friends. Maybe you are surprised to see me here. I'm right now at the Bosphorus on the European side in Istanbul, Turkey. This is the so-called July 15th Martyrs Bridge, which is one of 3 major bridges that connect the European part of Istanbul to the Asian part. The Asian part is on the other side. This is one of the great connections between Europe and Asia, and it's amazing that you have a city which lies on 2 continents. This already now and more into the future will be a very important connection between the continents on the new Silk Road, Belt and Road project, and what Lyndon LaRouche called the World Land Bridge. So this hopefully will become a major bridge for peace, stability, and economic development around the world. And of course, as a dialogue of cultures and civilizations. Because the aim is not simply to connect physically, but also to connect nations and cultures and religions to create a peaceful world. So goodbye for now from Istanbul. This is Hussein Askari. Okay, so isn't it funny that a person is standing there exactly at the moment when Turkey starts a military incursion into another country, and it's reported as that this is going to be a big disaster, that there will be slaughter of the Kurds and so on and so forth. And here I am standing there talking about peace among nations and among continents, because that's what will happen. I think if this whole situation is managed carefully, and the reason for my optimism is that for the first time I see there are adults in the room, adults like President Putin, President Trump, and who are also making others in the region, like Turkey, Syria, Saudi Arabia, everybody who are involved in this conflict, to also become adults and deal with this situation with a new look at the situation. Now, I'm not a fan of President Erdogan. We have said very harsh things about what he has done, what his government has done in Syria since the start of this crisis, because Turkey was the main conduit of the weapons funding and the terrorists who went into Syria and devastated that country. But President Erdogan has changed in the course of that, thanks mostly to the intervention by President Putin in 2015, but also President Trump since 2017. Concerning the Kurds, I am not against the Kurds. I'm actually a friend of the Kurds. I was brought up in a Kurdish city in Iraq, Suleimania, since I was 5 years until I was 19 years when I joined the university, and then I returned back. One brother and one sister were born in Suleimania among the Kurds and were raised there. So all my brothers and sisters, we are bilingual, Kurdish, Arabic. And the people in this Kurdish city and all the Kurds who know me have deep respect for me and for my family because they knew that we sympathized with them. But we also shared the suffering with the Kurdish people. I believe the Kurds suffered a lot. They have legitimate aspirations that should be respected and taken care of. The problem is that their leadership, political leadership, historically and until now, have been trading with the Kurdish cause, selling themselves to whoever, regional or international power, who would offer them some support. The problem is that when these temporary allies and friends finish their business, geopolitical business, and no longer need the Kurds, they just abandon them. And the Kurds every time feel abandoned. So that's not a problem. The Kurds can have their rights preserved as citizens. Like now, they have called on the Syrian army to come and protect them, to regain sovereignty over the territories of the country. Now the Kurds in Syria are Syrian citizens. They should have the rights of citizens. The same, the Kurds in Turkey, they're Turkish citizens, and so on and so forth.
I'll stop there, but obviously I think you may have heard something very, very different from the narrative in our, it's not just fake news, it's public relations firms run by the 17 intelligence agencies that are trying to overthrow this presidency, who are putting out what we are supposed to believe about the world and about these regions. And I would encourage everybody to take the time to watch the rest of this, because he locates historically the many threads that have gone into creating this difficulty, but also you see why the fact that if the United States breaks from the British imperial geopolitical game, that the entire world changes. And this is why, to get back to what I was saying, no matter what battles are won legally or otherwise in defense of President Trump, they cannot afford to allow him to carry out his policy. And that is why it is so urgent that the American population understand what's at stake and that we actually identify correctly what the enemy is, and not be confused by the press, which everyone says they don't like, but then they go along and allow their opinions to be shaped by it. So I'll leave it there and let Dennis Speed address this from a higher standpoint.
We may have to bring in a very tall ladder. What we want to do is to start to talk with you about something that Lyndon LaRouche continually addressed and is the basis of the political practice that is emerging in a very messy way in the United States. It's emerging largely because President Donald Trump is a messy person, and he doesn't do things with the kind of decorum or etiquette that has come to be associated with the poverty of American political practice for the past 5 decades. It was Lyndon LaRouche who, particularly in his more active years of the 80s and 90s in the United States and 70s, really brought this practice to a happy high level. And it was and is the case that that practice is the most important contribution in one sense that LaRouche made to changing the character, meaning in this case particularly literally the practice of American politics. Donald Trump's own election is only possible in the aftermath of the 1980s campaigns of Lyndon LaRouche. And is generally admitted to be such among intelligence agencies. That's exactly why back in May of 2016, the intelligence agent Rachel Maddow was given the assignment to make it clear to some people that needed to know that there was a serious possibility that Donald Trump could be elected because even more bizarre things had occurred in American political life. And with that, she began a 20-minute segment, the first 7 minutes of which was about Lyndon LaRouche and was about the LaRouche presidential campaigns of 1980. Well, the presidential campaign and then particularly the Illinois victory of 1986. And so her point was that the even more elliptically kooky Lyndon LaRouche had emerged, so one should not assume that Donald Trump could not be elected to the White House. Now, I'm saying that because this is something which is acknowledged, is well known among the intelligence community, although not among the less intelligent of the intelligence community, which is exactly why we continue to get away time and time again, particularly in this period, with shocking people with the power of what we're able to do with virtually no people and no money, but with ideas. And that is not an echo merely of Lyndon LaRouche. It's an attempt to make it clear to those who might be confused about these matters that Lyndon LaRouche is more alive than most of the people in the United States Congress. And is distinguished from a person like, from something called Barack Obama in that he actually does exist. Now, this is important because what's happened is that in part, many Americans are finding themselves unhappy in the present circumstance because what has happened is all of the comfort zones that they assumed to exist, like Fox News, for example, have all been blown up. They've all been blown up by Donald Trump. That's interesting as to how that's worked, and people are really baffled by it, and therefore you have things like this ambivalence about what Trump is doing in Syria. Whereas Trump was not ambivalent about what he was doing in Syria. He made it very clear. He said, the hardest thing I have to deal with is not the witch hunt. It's signing letters of to parents about the deaths of their sons and daughters for nothing. And I'm not going to continue to do that. And then he said, in various locations, particularly one tweet to the so-called left and the left liberals, hey, I thought all you guys were against war. Where are you? Sometimes silence is not golden. And you haven't heard from them, except now, of course, Tulsi Gabbard is going to be forced to talk by the ever reliable Hillary Clinton, who can be always relied on exactly when you thought people couldn't get to be more stupid, to say something which then galvanizes an entirely other section of people who have remained quiet into, in fact, the camp of opposition to the last thing that she said. I mean, she is simply morally accident-prone. She doesn't understand it because she doesn't really understand what she did when she signed up for the job at State Department with Barack Obama. She's never really understood that. She can't face it. She doesn't understand that the entire process, and not that it began then, but it was codified. It was the point at which the Mephistophelian deal was made, and you could not come back. She'll never come back. She can never, ever be whatever shadow of a human being she earlier was. Can't get back to it. We, of course, could all talk about the we saw he died moment and things like that, but that kind of misses it, because then you think about the person as simply being a monster as opposed to understanding how flimsy and puppet-like they truly are. And that is what Donald Trump gets about the so-called oligarchy. Now, I'm not saying to you that Donald Trump is some sort of political genius, but he is from Queens. Now, that doesn't mean the people from Queens are geniuses either, but it's a way of seeing reality. It's the people that understand the crooked cops. It's the people that understand the kind of deals that you have to make just to be able to send your kids to a good school. It's just the daily life that you're forced to recognize is a condition. It doesn't mean you have to compromise with it. It doesn't mean you have to become pragmatic about it. And what you have with respect to Trump right now is that he has decided to step on the third rail of international politics, and that is the British establishment and the extended British establishment, referred to as by him as the military-industrial complex, but more correctly, I think, referred to as the military de-industrial complex. Because what's happening now is that a change has been made since the time of Eisenhower. And in one sense, it's a change which is important to note about what Donald Trump is doing. He's not just stepped on the third rail, he stomped on it after he stepped on it. So whereas others believed you get electrocuted by stepping on that third rail, he's gotten energized by it. And that's what you saw down in, for example, Texas, in the rally that happened down there. And also you see it in the figures that are coming in about his popularity, the fundraising figures coming in from the state of Washington, where Trump had this time comparatively in the 2016 election. I think he had 6 people that had contributed. He has now 21,000, and he has more than anybody else. And people are wondering, how is that possible? There's utter chaos. I mean, he's basically alienated everybody. That's exactly how it's possible. That's precisely why it works. Now, LaRouche was a fierce, relentless, and very consistent proponent of the idea of the polemical method. I mean, Lynn did not believe in and taught us that there was no such thing as objective journalism. It never has existed and never will exist. You always have a point of view, and you are always advocating a point of view. It is possible to tell the truth in the course of doing that, but it is not possible to not have a point of view. Just like it's not possible to not have a point of view when you advance a scientific hypothesis. You've got to have a point of view. You may be having a point of view about a process that's occurring in nature as you understand it, but the changes in the processes of nature that you are proposing can exist have to come from an idea in your head. That idea is subjective. It is not objective. And so he insisted that when we were writing or doing anything else, there was a conception or a standard that we had to fight for. Many of those ideas that are either presumed or tolerated as true are now under assault. They range from the generally accepted, quote, the U.S. economy is the best economy in the world and it's in the best shape it's ever been, which is repeated by all kinds of people, to the we never went to the moon variety of kookery that inflicts less and less of people, as evidence from Indian and Chinese and American missions begins to come in, and people start to argue about budgets, and all of a sudden becomes very real because Elon Musk is going to go to the moon. See? Now it's real because Amazon's going to go, because Bezos will go, so therefore we really are going to the moon because they're doing it. We're going to get past a lot of that. And what's happening is that it's eroding. And what's happening to people, and I don't mean it's just happening just to people in the Congress, but it's happening, but they are a good place to start. What's happening to these people is the same thing that happened to the former head of East Germany, Erich Honecker. We talked about this a little bit on our Thursday phone call because it was the exact anniversary of his being called out of office. And that, he was a big deal. He was a hard head. He was the guy that built the Berlin Wall. He had a kind of a famous reputation because he was one of the young communists that was imprisoned by the Nazis. So he had real street credibility. But in 1961, in August, when the East Germany began to run out of harvesters for their harvest, I mean, they didn't have enough people because people were leaving so fast, they built a wall. And he built the wall. So then 30 years ago, in January, this past January, he stated that the wall was going to be there for 50 more years, 100 more years, or as long as the reason for it was there. He shouldn't have said the last part, because this didn't actually cohere with the 50 years or the 100 years. And it certainly didn't cohere with what he later said, which was in, I think it was October 6th or 7th, when they had just had the 40th anniversary celebration of China's revolution of 1949, and then they had East Germany. And what happened was there was a revolt staged among some of his prized cadre. Gorbachev was there, and they started yelling, "Gorby, help us, help us, help us." And it was very embarrassing, and at one point, Honecker decided to make the statement. He should have had a sense of irony about what he was saying, that East Germany would last for 1,000 years. Now, this is a communist from the Communist Youth Movement who had been imprisoned by the Nazis, and apparently doesn't remember the last time that somebody talked about a 1,000-year Reich. But he says this about East Germany. It's going to last for 1,000 years. 10 days later, he's sitting in a meeting. It's a Central Committee meeting. And they go through the usual thing, and then there's a usual point that you get to in the meeting where you say, well, is there any further business? Because everything has been done. And one guy says, yeah, actually, I have an item I'd like to add. He says, yeah, fine, no problem. He said, well, I move that you no longer be the head of the party or of East Germany. You'll be replaced. There's a minute of silence. Then he does what you're supposed to do. Say, okay, well, I guess we have to entertain this motion. And 3 hours later, he's caused to vote for his own resignation. Now, then, to make matters even worse, to put a fine point on it, that's October 17th. So 23 days later, the Berlin Wall is down. The Berlin Wall that is supposedly being protected not only by East Germany and its fanaticism, but also by the 40,000-plus nuclear warheads of the Soviet Union. It's all gone. It takes a little while, about a year. Now, he could have saved himself a lot of trouble. All he had to do was to actually listen to the recording that his secret police would have had of Lyndon LaRouche making a speech in Berlin at the Kempinski Hotel 1 year earlier. I mean, Lyndon was in Berlin. And so he was right there in Honecker's backyard. He made a speech. And in his speech, what Lynn said is that the time had come for a reunification of Germany with Berlin as the capital, and that this should be something that was discussed and was organized between the United States and the Soviet Union, that Ronald Reagan in particular and the persons in the Soviet Union should negotiate this. This had to do with the crisis of the Soviet economy, specifically crisis within production of food, and that Poland could be used as a kind of test case for collaboration between the two sides. So, Poland, because of the economic conditions, but also because it was thought that this would represent a theater of cooperation which would demonstrate that such a joint mission would be a win-win proposition both for the Soviet Union and for the West, for the East Bloc and for NATO, and so forth. Nobody listened. Instead, 2 days after Lyndon LaRouche gave his speech, he got indicted in the United States in Alexandria, Virginia. And the second railroad began. The first one didn't work up in Boston. The second one was started. So Honecker didn't listen. The Soviets didn't listen. And they lost the wall. They lost East Germany. They lost the Soviet Union because they didn't listen. It's the irony of the fact that the man who sat in jail on November 9th, Lyndon LaRouche, had actually won. But these people weren't going to know for a little bit more time. And the day after the wall began to come down, 2 days after, Lynn then formulated what became known as first the Eurasian Triangle. It was a policy of Paris, Bonn, and Moscow being connected by a magnetically levitated train route, or high-speed rail as we called it, but also magnetically levitated train, and that there was an area, what was called the Dreieck, or the triangle, which represented an area about the geographical size of Japan, which had more skilled labor within it at that moment than any place else on Earth. And it meant that this was a region which spanned the crossroads between the wall and the demarcation line of east and west, which it could be used as the powerhouse, as the production center, as the workplace of the whole world. That's what was proposed. And that is what is called the lost opportunity of 1989. It was Helga Sepp LaRouche who wrote and chronicled this, as Helga had done in a few other cases. Helga spent quite a bit of time trying to get people to understand why Friedrich Schiller is the most important person to study if you want to have some kind of an advanced conception of foreign policy. And she tried to form the Schiller Institute as an adjunct of, or a portion, a part of the United States State Department. That was the original idea of Schiller Institute. But that was rejected because that couldn't be understood. Only Ronald Reagan really was able to understand, apparently, and a couple of his associates, obviously, LaRouche sufficiently to begin the process, which had begun in 1983 with the acceptance of the SDI proposal, the pronouncement of the SDI proposal, that Ronald Reagan made. And it's worth thinking about the fact that it was in 1986 that Lyndon LaRouche's associates won the elections in Illinois, completely surprising and astounding everyone in that state, including themselves. But this was a process that came out of an arc of a process that was actually from Lyndon LaRouche's presidential campaigns. You know those failed presidential campaigns where he got no votes? And he would just do these chaotic kind of things, tilting at windmills, putting himself on television in these ego sort of driven 30-minute infomercials. Well, that process that people treated that way over time, and the arc of time from 1984 particularly, although the presidential campaigns began earlier, you can say even from 76, but the arc of time, particularly between 84 through 86, and those electoral victories, is what the unfortunate Rachel Maddow is actually referring to. That's what she's talking about. And that was the stalking horse, if you want to put it that way, for what happened in 2016. It did not occur as such merely because of the presidential campaign of Donald Trump. No such thing. There was something that had been happening in America, and it had been happening for decades, and it was led by a person who was ingenious in his approach. But he had an idea which he called metaphor. So I want to now say a couple of things about directly from Lynn on this. He begins his paper on the subject of metaphor. Now, I just want to say I am not doing the paper at all. I am doing the first, 3 or 4 paragraphs of this paper. That's all we're covering here. And it's really going to be covered inadequately in the sense that it will only seem to indicate to you the topic. But it's relevant to try to do this in order that we can fortify you and others that are going to be watching for the political battle that you have been thrown headlong into, whether you like it or not. Because that's just how Donald Trump apparently is, which I happen to like very much, since that's the way that Lyndon LaRouche used to do things. They're very different personalities, very different background, very different circumstance. But what has happened is that you are now caused to fight, whether you intended to or not, as Tulsi Gabbard, for example, is finding out. So he began his paper by saying, during the 25-odd-year reign of today's New Age cult, and this was written about 1990, 91, I think, and there 92. So think about, let's say, the period from about 1965 to 1990. That's what he's talking about. That 25-year reign. During the 25-odd-year reign of today's New Age cult, an ominous crippling of the United States individual's cognitive functioning has been building. This loss of mental capacity is presently affecting a growing majority among the under 50 generations. Much of this damage is attributable directly to the multifaceted influence of a modernist dogma which usually parades under such various names as systems analysis, linguistics, and information theory. Now, I just want to reference something to people. I don't here want to recommend this book. I'm just indicating to you. There's a book which is called From Counterculture to Cyberculture. And then it has a kind of a subtitle, Stuart Brand, The Whole Earth Network, and the Rise of Digital Utopianism. Its first chapter is called The Shifting Politics of the Computational Metaphor. So I'm going to go through this for you because it's easy for anybody who was from the 60s. There was a time, and if you ever saw things like Rod Serling's Twilight Zone, or you remember things like, the TV series Secret Agent, they've given you a number and taken away your name. You remember that the whole idea was that we were not going to be numbered, because that meant if you were being numbered, that you no longer had your own identity, okay? Like the man used to say, I will not be pushed, stamped, filed, indexed, briefed, debriefed, or numbered. These were phrases you heard all of the time in the 1960s, because to become a number was to become dehumanized. And one of the reasons for that was the tattoo on the arm of the concentration camp victims. That's one of the things that people thought about when they were saying that. Now, all over the society, people tattoo themselves. Everybody's got a tattoo. And the tattoo expresses your individuality. Yeah, you and the other 40 million people that have them. Now, here's a question for you. Could you suddenly create a fad in the society presently in which you had each person pick a number and then tattoo themselves with it as an expression of their individuality? Would that be done discreetly, like wait until the last concentration camp victims have actually totally perished? Or will that be a fashion statement in the next 2 or 3 years? Before you start to talk about the United States Congress and all of the things that clearly go on there, because there is no Republican or Democratic Party, in case you didn't notice, they're only intelligence agencies now. There's no media any longer. They're only intelligence agencies now. But before you start to go after that and look at what people like to call the deep state that nobody can find, how about looking at the state of your own mind? That you can find. That's easily findable, right? Maybe not. Maybe it's not that easy to look at the state of your own mind. Think about it. Think about the rappers. Think about all of the people who are the cool people. Think about the people that are dealing in all these sort of, entertainment fields. You know what they talk about? How many eyeballs are going to our site? Not minds, eyeballs. Now, those that may be familiar with the old torture practices of the fascist Ustashi during the Second World War wince knowingly when they hear these terms. Because whereas people think they're using them as slang, where people think they came up with it, you didn't come up with it. Writing from his prison, again from the Metaphor paper, Lynn said this. He said, "A generation has passed since the time that it was still fashionable to assess a pupil's progress in terms of that student's ability to apply prior learning to the effect of discovering promptly appropriate constructions of relevant solutions to unfamiliar problems." Some of us managed to get that. Those of us who barely survived to get it in the elementary school, it's called problem solving. You know, they would give you these tests, and instead of it just being a mathematics test, it would be a problem-solving test. So you'd have to sit there, and they would pose a question to you, and you had to try to figure that out. Now, even that was the degenerate form of what Lynn is talking about, but it was a form of it. Actually, the guys in shop and the guys who were doing auto repair were actually doing more real intellectual work than we were. The people who had to learn how to read blueprints and actually visualize how to build a building, how to, for example, make a straight edge on a building on a curved surface, were doing more intellectual work than we were. But we were told we were better because you shouldn't get your hands dirty. So Lynn says, thus today's modernist classrooms have been turned away from what is too often reviled as authoritarian teaching of conceptions. More and more, the modernists' democratic classroom and sterile textbook merely, quote, provide information. So now this gets us into the section in which he begins to talk about what he calls metaphor. He says, such observations pose the question, what makes an ostensibly innocent technical doctrine such as information theory, or your waving around all day this? What makes that so wickedly pathological in its social effects? The most efficient tack for exposing the answer to that question is a more rigorous Socratic definition of the fine arts term metaphor. We signify metaphor as William Empson, who is an author, British author, as William Empson's 7 Types of Ambiguity, that's the name of his book, has identified it. For one, as a phenomenon customarily associated with classical forms of poetry and drama. However, by more rigorous, we should also show metaphor as the crucial feature of those thought processes bearing upon the geometrical fundamentals of physical science. Now, let's just give a couple of examples of this so that we don't begin to get people are wondering. I can put up the first slide. I just want it up there as an image. And as that's going up, let me just give an example of something we tried to do. We tried our best. Diane already referenced it, to bring a concept of metaphor up by talking about this idea of eating babies. Somebody tried to do it, tried to actually inform Ocasio-Cortez that there was a conclusion to be drawn from what she was stating, and try to also inform the audience. No response. That is called no change. Now, the concept in ideas that Lynn has talked about consistently is the idea of change, no change. So what occurred in that room on that occasion was that a group of people who believed themselves to be passionately committed to saving the planet. And if you have not seen George Carlin's comment on this, you might want to take a look at that, where he says, as if the planet could be saved. The planet doesn't need you to save it. It's been through extinction events, it's been through volcanic eruptions, floods, you name it, cosmic rays. The planet doesn't need you to save it. You think a little bit of styrofoam threatens this planet? And he goes on and on like that. And this is just, George Carlin, of course, been deceased for a long time, just decided one day, right here actually at the Beacon Theater, where it was actually filmed, to just riff on this and just sort of went off. Because he said, these people, these self-serving, egotistical, what do you call them, Beaujolais drinkers or something like that he called them. And he just sort of couldn't contain himself because he had had enough of seeing that phenomenon. The idea of metaphor. Let's take the state of Texas. Because what Empson says about metaphor is that that's where you take a phrase in a language or a word in a language and you make it mean multiple things. you do it in such a way that the one phrase or the one word actually means a multiplicity of things. In other words, you don't try to make the meaning precise. It's the opposite. You do it so that what happens is that suddenly the meaning is shown to be the opposite of the words. So when, for example, Ocasio-Cortez was confronted with the Eat Babies t-shirt, and, you know, we can't even kill enough people by bombing Russia, there's a metaphor here. It's unspoken. You're supposed to be able to see it. No one in the room could see it. But all the people looking at it could see it. Or many of the people could see it. Now, people didn't know whether it was real or not, but they understood, whoa, this person is either utterly, thoroughly, really demented and is part of their group, or this is a joke on their group, which is utterly, thoroughly demented. That's what you had, okay? So that's the way it works. It uses irony, but it's done in a certain way. Now, there's another way to think about it. Let's look at the issue, the state of Texas. What's going on in the state of Texas? Wasn't the state of Texas the place where JFK got shot? And isn't it the place that the Bush family dominated? Isn't it the place where, for example, Prince Bandar of Saudi Arabia used to meet with the Bushes all the time? Well, but Texas has seen two rallies in the last month or so, Narendra Modi and Trump at the Indian rally, and then the rally that happened there in Dallas of 50,000 people, which Keisha Rogers and an associate attended, Ron Patak, they were there, and about 30,000 people outside, 20,000 people inside. It's also NASA. It's also where Keisha Rogers won primaries as a Democratic Party candidate again some years ago. So when you say the word Texas, what's it mean? Well, it depends on what you presume to speak about. You can't talk about something called the political process in Texas. As the Reverend James Bevel used to say to us, what would I even be talking about? You know, what are you referring to when you use these terms? And this is important so that people can understand when you use the term left wing or right wing, which you may notice we don't use. As LaRouche movement people do not use these terms. Everybody else likes to use these terms. We never use them. We know there is no right wing and there is no left wing. We know that that refers to the seating arrangements in the French National Assembly during the 18th century. And we know that there is no such thing. That's why we know that there is no longer a Republican or Democratic Party. They did used to exist. They were there. When Ronald Reagan was there was a Republican Party. But he was an FDR Democrat. And that's why Lyndon LaRouche and he could collaborate on the policy that they jointly proposed. That is, Lynn had put the policy forward as a point of discussion, not merely with Reagan, but with the Soviet Union. And he had engaged in a set of discussions, a dialogue, and there was a conclusion. And the conclusion was, on the part of the Soviet Union, that is, as conveyed by their representative, there's no possible way that this can happen. That is, either this is not real, because really what you're really trying to do is probe our defenses and probe our research in laser weapons, which therefore means it's not real, or you can't do this because you don't have the political power to do it, because we've checked you out. You have virtually no political power in the United States. That's what they were saying to us. I mean, you have nobody in the Congress, nobody in the governorship, nobody in a state legislature. You don't even have people in the city council. I mean, we hear you come here, you say you're Lyndon LaRouche, and we look you up, we look at your campaigns in the past, we look at your percentages. Now, I'm not saying that's all they said, but they were making a point that you don't have the power to do this. So either it's simply an intelligence probe, you may even be deluded about that, but that's what it de facto is, or it's just weird. You know, you're here and we're talking and it's nice because, you know, you have good ideas, but, and Lynn's response was, I only have to convince one guy. Now that simply seems to people that don't understand the notion of irony to not be possible. I put this up here only because Lynn refers to his paper, and I'm only going to reference it so you go read it, to the John Keats poem, Ode on a Grecian Urn. Let's go to the next one briefly. The next slide will be fuzzy, but it's relevant when he gets it. Because Lynn says that the breakthrough made by the Greeks was the notion of, particularly in sculpture, capturing motion, and that the idea of motion, the movement from, including inside of the mind, and being able to show that in stone, that irony of being able to have something living in stone, that this is the characteristic which distinguishes them, for example, from the Egyptians. Not the later Egyptians of Fayum and so on, but the Egyptians of the earlier period prior to Greece. This brings us to something which I just want to refer to, and this is what Diane talked about a little bit earlier, and this was something that was quoted on Thursday evening on our call from A Defense of Poetry, where Mike Steagall was referring to Shelley's essay, and I put it up here together with Keats because both they were very close friends, but also because the conception of poetry of both, which is that poetry was the province of truth and beauty, which were the same thing. That poetry is the province of truth and beauty, which are the same thing. Shelley had said at the conclusion of his essay, the person in whom this power resides may often, as far as regards many portions of their nature, have little apparent correspondence with that spirit of good of which they are the ministers. This is people's problem with Trump. That is the problem people have with Trump. They have made it a requirement that they have to like their leaders. And there is nothing more degenerate in a population than requiring that you must like your leaders. That is a sign of decadence in a population. You must require that you wish leadership in your leaders. And that is a different standard. And so when leadership is suddenly shown, despite the fact that you intensely dislike that individual, you're supposed to understand that that is something that you have to support. That's called a constitutional republic. I admit that is not a constitutional democracy. That's why you don't live in one, because that mistake was not made by the founders. The founders knew that you would have this precise sort of circumstance emerge. Then what do you do? What do you do if you have an individual that a lot of people don't like, but suddenly he turns around and says, you know, $8 trillion in this place called the Middle East? Have you checked out what it looks like now compared to what it looked like when we started? Do you know what our national budget is in this country? Do you know what that translates into in terms of what we could have done with infrastructure? No, we're not doing this. And now ask yourself seriously, how can anybody in the United States over the age of 7 not understand that? So you know that everybody understands it. There is no American that does not understand what Donald Trump is saying about that. Now, I take a little bit of time on that just because some people will remember back during 9/11, 1 month later, when you could finally go out on the street because New York City was reopened. You actually wouldn't allow assemblies. We did a little bit of organizing. But we went out with signs in New York City which said, everyone knows, including you, that Osama bin Laden did not do this. 1 month later, everyone knows, including you. And that was the important part. There was a reason we said it. I'm not going to go through that now. I don't need to explain it now. If it comes up in questions or otherwise, we can talk about it. But the point here is that there's truth. And there is a beauty to truth. The beauty is that it's not really deniable, including by the people that deny it. So Eric Honecker could deny that the wall was going to come down. But the very denial of that is what put him behind walls. So he was behind walls 1 month after. You know, he was summarily dismissed from being head of state. He went from head of state to prison, and other people, even just a year later, like Václav Havel and all, literally went from prison to the presidency. How's that happen? Who did that? Well, I'll tell you something. There's nobody you can find, as Helga can tell you, that in Germany at that time could credibly claim they were responsible for the wall coming down. Nobody. So how'd it come down? Well, it was a belief among some of us that it had a lot to do with Beethoven. And we won't go into that here because there will be a November 9th, 30th anniversary celebration we'll be doing here, not in this room, but in New York City. Schiller Institute will commemorate this. And there are many questions like that I think will be being addressed about that. But I'll say something to indicate it. The most unfailing herald, companion, and follower of the awakening of a great people to work a beneficial change in opinion or institution is poetry. At such periods, there is an accumulation of the power of communicating and receiving intense and impassioned conceptions respecting man and nature. I know that people have heard these sentences before, but it's important to think about this in terms of what we find ourselves entering. Because whatever you may think about the financial circumstances, whether or not there's going to be a crash, whether you agree with us on that or not, you cannot deny that what is in front of us is a disintegration of all the institutions that people presumed composed the previous society. They're all going. And so one thing we would, I think, want to do is try to get an idea about the difference between, let's say, poetry and symbolism. Let me refer to something that Lynn said. He was asked the question, this was at a conference that we had, a Schiller Institute conference, and the question was, I was wondering about the difference between metaphor and symbolism and was wondering if you can explain the difference. So Lynn said, well, metaphor is actually an idea. A simile is not, first of all. Metaphor pertains to the gaps in description. All the classical dialogues of Plato involve the principle of metaphor. For example, in the case of the discovery of the principle of gravitation, that in a decadent culture, up through the 16th century or most of it, it was generally believed that what we could know in the physical universe was merely a description of some consistent pattern of behavior as observed with the senses. Now, what Kepler showed, and this was the character of the metaphor, was that the orbit of Mars, in the first instance, was not circular, which made it a fairly irregular motion. But worse than that, the motion within the ellipse, if it's not a circle, it was an ellipse, was not uniform even within the terms of the ellipse. But the motion was based on this principle of equal areas, equal time. We're going to go over that in just a minute. But notice what he did here. He said it's about the gap. That's what a metaphor is. And it is the filling in of the gap, which is the sovereign action of the individual. And that's what was supposed to happen, and did happen, when we saw Ocasio-Cortez confronted in the way she was. She's supposed to fill in the gap. But there was a gap between her ears and everybody else. It wasn't a gap because you couldn't fill it in. It was a gap because the axioms that they brought to the table at that moment made it impossible for them to see what was actually going on. They couldn't see the reality. It was right in front of them. They couldn't see it. Their axioms did not allow them to see it. They chose. Well, in one sense, maybe they didn't, because maybe axioms are involuntary. Well, there's where irony comes in. That's the idea of humor. You come up across an axiom and you blow it up. And the individual is suddenly awakened, sort of like, you know, that thing where it's 3 a.m. in the morning and you thought you got away with something, or your mother, you know, you did something, you stayed out late, or you whatever, took money out of her purse or something, and you're sleeping. 3 a.m. 3 a.m. Bucket of ice water. And you wake up, and she's just standing there. And she just says, well, you got to sleep sometime. So you know what has happened. And you know that she knows. This is the idea that we have about our politics. A lot of our politics has to be a bucket of ice water. Because what you're trying to do is you're trying to prove to people that there is no place to hide from themselves. If you can do that, then you can mobilize the American people. I want to go to something. There's a poetry versus symbolism. Let's go to the next slide. I want to get this up to a poem by Edgar Poe. There's a poem by Edgar Poe. And I want to tell you about a place. There was a long book written by James Fenimore Cooper called The Bravo. And it was about Venice. Poe wrote a poem called The City in the Sea. This is the poem. And we're going to just say a few things about Venice first, and then we'll just read this first part. Because he never says that this poem is about Venice. And in fact, one can argue that it's not about Venice. Matter of fact, it's actually true that it is about it, it is not about it. Both are the case. A recent travelogue on Venice, it's a video show, has 3 short references that I just picked from the internet. For those of you who would like to visit there sometime, I was there last year. The Doge's Palace. The Doge was the head of Venice, and he headed this committee of 1,200 merchants. And they ran the most powerful navy in the world. This is back in the period of the 16th century. They had 5,000 ships, and they had the most important, they, in one sense, innovated the assembly line, production of ships at that time. Doge's Palace. It says here, quote, worth a visit for the glamorous public rooms, but especially if they open up the torture chambers and prison cells in the roof, including the one that Casanova was put in. They revealed the darker side of life in the Venetian Republic. Okay? That's the advertisement of Doge's Palace, why you should go. Okay? Now here's another one for a cafe, Cafe Florian. In the 18th and 19th centuries, Venice was the pleasure capital of Europe, full of prostitutes and courtesans who would wear ridiculously high heels so they could be seen above the crowd. Cafe Florian in St. Mark's Square claims to be the oldest cafe in the world. While you're enjoying a cappuccino served by waiters in tails, remember that there used to be a brothel on the first floor. Okay? Final travel advisory for you if you're planning to go there. Ponte della Tette. The Bridge of Tits is where prostitutes stood with their breasts on display so that potential clients could see their wares. And in an age when homosexuality was considered undesirable, so that the authorities could check that they weren't men. Okay? There's your travelogue for Venice, folks. Sign up. Oh, I didn't go to Venice for that. Okay, so this poem begins, Lo, death has reared himself a throne in a strange city, lying alone far down within the dim west, where the good and the bad and the worst and the best have gone to their eternal rest. There, shrines and palaces and towers, time-eaten towers that tremble not, resemble nothing that is ours. Around by lifting winds forgot, resignedly beneath the sky, the melancholy waters lie. So that's the first part of the poem. Let's go to the second thing. I'm not going to go through the whole thing. I just want to give you some idea of it. No rays from the holy heaven come down on the long night of that time of that town, but light from out the lurid sea streams up the turrets silently. Go to the next slide. Yes. Resignedly beneath the sky, the melancholy waters lie. So blend the turrets and shadows there that all seems pendulous in air, while from a proud tower in the town, death looks gigantically down. That's the Doge's palace. Venice is this famous thing, people all talk about it, about the water, right? And about the idea that the whole city is seen in reflection in the water. And it's used as a metaphor to talk about Venice and intelligence. For those that, we didn't say this, but Venice, of course, was the center of political intelligence. And it is Venice which is the ancestor of Britain and of the Netherlands, Amsterdam and London, which were known as New Venice. That's where Venice refounded itself after its demise. And whenever you hear us say British Empire or British imperial system, it's this that we're referring to. Go to the next one. We're going to actually go through these pretty quickly now. I think I'm going to skip this. Let me just get to the end. And when amid no earthly moans, down the town shall settle hence, hell rising from 1,000 thrones shall do it reverence. Now, I don't know if you all know this, but Venice is sinking. And it's sort of a well-known thing. And what the poem talks about is that there is some motion. Go back one, and I'll just reference that so people see it. It says at one point, but lo, a stir is in the air, the wave. There is a movement there, as if the towers had thrust aside in slightly sinking the dull tide, as if their tops had feebly given a void within the filmy heaven. But what happens is that the city sinks, and that's the only motion. So the idea is it's oppressive, or I can say more about it, but to just make the point here. The idea of saying that death has reared a throne far down within the dim west, well, that's not within the ocean. And the good and the bad and the worst and the best have gone to their eternal rest. Hell rising from 1,000 thrones shall do it reverence. These are not their images, but there's an idea. And the idea is in the title, The City in the Sea. So when you're trying to describe evil, unless you want to be part of it and you do the kind of thing that the travelogue did, which is simply literally a travelogue for Venice. But if you wish to actually characterize the idea of Venice, you do this. And the point here is that this is what we have to think of how we are going to proceed. We have to begin, in other words, to get away from the literal in all of our work. And I'm not saying that we haven't been doing that or we don't know something about that, but I want to give you sort of an idea about this. At one point in the Shelley discussion, he uses a very specific formulation at the end of Defense of Poetry. He says, poets are the hierophants of an unapprehended inspiration, the mirrors of the gigantic shadows which futurity casts upon the present. The mirrors of the gigantic shadows which futurity casts upon the present. Some of you may know that when Abraham Lincoln gave his speech to Congress in December of 1862, he proposed to the Congress that there should be a proposition put in front of the seceded states of the Union that they should rejoin the Union, and that the Union would in turn, if they rejoined, compensate them for the slaves. Yes, they would pay them reparations for the loss of their property. Now, many people take great umbrage at this. But what Lincoln went on to say is, well, there's a reason we can do that. And he said the reason that that can be done and that that does not represent a significant financial loss by the United States is this, and this is his argument. I'm just going to refer to it. Our abundant room, our broad national homestead is our ample resource. Were our territory as limited as are the British Isles, very certainly our population could not expand as stated. Instead of receiving the foreign-born as now, we should be compelled to send part of the native-born away. But such is not our condition. And then he gives, we have 2.9 million square miles. Europe has 3.8 million, with a population averaging 73 1/3 persons to the square mile. Why may not our country at some time average as many? Is it less fertile? Has it more waste surface by mountains, rivers, lakes, deserts, or other causes? Is it inferior to Europe in any natural advantage? If then we are at some time to be as populous as Europe, how soon? As to when this may be, we can judge by the past and the present. As to when it will be, if ever, depends much on whether we maintain the Union. So then what he does is he has a projection, and he just looks at population growth in the United States between 1790 and 1860. Once he does that, Lincoln then projects the population of the United States until the year 1930. He says, well, if we just simply continue to grow at the same rate we're growing now, we'll certainly have enough people to be able to make this problem of the financial loss of slavery that people are claiming as a loss, it will be negligible. So he estimates, Lincoln estimates, that the population of the United States in the year 1900 is going to be 103 million. The actual population of the United States in 1900 was 76 million. Lincoln says that the population of the United States in 1930 will be 251 million, about which he's very excited. The actual U.S. population in 1930 was 123 million. It was half the population Abraham Lincoln wished to see. What happened? Oh, we became more enlightened, and we realized that that would be too many people because, well, that's an interesting one. And if you look at that history, and if you look at that time, and you look at the role of things like the Immigration Restriction League, and you look at the role of the British Eugenics Society, and you look at the role of people like Julian Huxley and other people, now you understand Ocasio-Cortez. Now you understand Al Gore. But you can't tolerate it. You can't tolerate it. Where we are and what it is that we have to do and what the function of irony is, what the function of metaphor is, what Lynn was driving at in what he had to say about these things, I want to go to just for a minute the Kepler slide. This is where Lynn was describing, I referenced this and I'll read it again, where he says, what Kepler showed, and this was the character of the metaphor, was that the orbit of Mars in the first instance was not circular. This is not the orbit of Mars, but this is a good illustration for the point, which makes it a fairly irregular motion. But worse than that, the motion within the ellipse was not uniform. So here's what the problem was. If motion is different everywhere along the orbit, then how do you calculate it? That was the problem. In other words, the planet is always either speeding up or slowing down. When it is closest to the Earth, that's what you see there on the right. The sun is that orb right there marked. That's called the perihelion. The planet is traveling faster. And when it's farthest away, the precise opposite, the aphelion, is traveling slower. But what gets interesting is, when is it doing which? What's the exact instant at which this is occurring? When does it stop going faster to suddenly go slower? You say, well, it happened at that point. Well, yeah, wait a minute. You're looking at an illustration. We're talking about physically, how does this work? And so what Kepler figured out was that, and I won't go through here why, because we should, but we don't have time now to do it, is that the area you're seeing there on the right, that shaded area, is equivalent, okay, to the areas that you're seeing in the other shaded areas. So that, in other words, the area swept out. Because the change in speed over to the right is faster than it is to the left, then the area swept out, the motion of the planet around the orbit is less on the left than it is on the right, but the actual area is the same. This is called the equal area in equal time law. So the fact that these things could be done required imagination. He couldn't go there to measure the orbit. And matter of fact, how do you even do that? Matter of fact, here's a good question for you. How do you measure this rate of change of speed of the Earth? Especially when you have to take into consideration the orbiting around its axis, the orbiting around the sun, and then the sun and the solar systems orbiting around the galaxy. How are these things measured? Not let alone the problem of the so-called precession of the axis, the Earth. The fact that there's a wobble in the rotation of the Earth, which is why the constellations change. How do you figure these things out if what they require is you to go and see these things? You can't see them. You never see them. It's within the idea of imagination. Where we stand as of today in the United States is people have to have the imagination to believe that Donald Trump actually did what he did. That is, what did he do? Say, we mean Syria? No. You mean firing Bolton? Well, that was nice, but no. What we mean is the pronouncement he made about the military-industrial complex. What he had to say about it. He said, now, you know, this thing makes a lot of money. They like war. I'm not doing that. So once that statement is made from the position of the greatest power of any individual in the world, which is with the presidency of the United States, that pronouncement, as with Reagan's SDI, can have the force of, if you would, when you call it this way, of natural law. What the Congress decides to do with that, yes, of course they should be advised by the people. But the people of the United States now know that once the president has pronounced on behalf of the general welfare, no other requirement need be fulfilled by him to mobilize the American people. There's nothing dictatorial about that, because the American people would have to agree to the idea in the mind of the presidency and then act on that idea. That's our job. That's the job of this movement. That's the job that Lyndon LaRouche took upon himself as a private citizen, as an individual citizen, in the writing of everything that he wrote. But that's also why he insisted to us, if you're going to do this, it has to have pungency, force, it has to be sharp, and it has to knock out the brains of falsehood. Don't do something that's half-baked, half-hearted, or half-assed. And so it's in this regard that if you take a look at our situation in America today, is the thing I want to end with, which is the LaRouche 4 laws. Can we just go to the bar diagrams for a minute? The LaRouche 4 laws, we've talked about, people have seen them, you know, these people say Glass-Steagall, the banking law, issuance of credit. Well, you can say these things, but what are they really? Now go to the population chart. That's what I want. Sorry. I think it's before, just before, the one just before. Yes. This is a little dark, but some of you have seen this. This is one of the bar diagrams in which Lynn tried to give the different, a conception, an idea of the way in which a workforce, a working population, would be composed. And so he has it separated in categories. We don't need to go through each one of them, but there's mining, agriculture, and so on in the bottom there. You see manufacturing in the center. And then you have medical, energy, so forth. And he accounts for unemployment. He accounts for administrative functions. And he accounts for also other functions as such. But what he tried to do was to identify the rough proportions of your population. You can call it a number, but it's not a number. It's a dynamic. It's a dynamic in which a set of functions, which he otherwise then shows, let's go to the next one now, in terms of a flow chart using a different form of bar diagram. But the issue is the population that you first saw composed as a productive unit. Now, these productive units are organized in households, yes, in families. And that productive unit of the family is the basis. But the idea of the activity, and I'm not going to go through this, you've been through the economics classes, and we can come back to talk about this. But the charts on the left, the bar diagrams on the left, are indicate population, division of agriculture and manufacturing and other, and then it has a flow of output. So the concept is change is the only thing that makes this population productive. A transformation of the productive forces of labor, and the productive forces of that population itself. A self-changing, self-developing, self-subsisting population and species. There is no other species like that on the earth. It requires imagination to do that. This is why no claim ever made about the notion of limitations of resources can ever be valid. And it's also why there is no condition under which there can ever be too many people. There can be too many people confined to a non-productive entropic condition of humanity somewhere. Sure, that can be true. There can be too many people in a crowded South Bronx rat trap. But that's not because there's too many people, it's because there's a rat trap. Under no circumstances could there ever be a condition on the earth in which there were too many people. Ever. If there is a productive human species that's using the power of imagination to transform the conditions of productivity. That's the whole point. And so while it's important to look at, of course, population statistics and population densities, and look at, of course, the technologies that have to be developed for that, it's more important to, first of all, start from the standpoint that if you ever bought into the idea that there were too many people, you were being bamboozled by an axiom that was intended to eliminate you. If you ever bought into the idea that there were too many people, you were being bamboozled by an axiom that was intended to eliminate you. See, what you don't know can not only hurt you, it can kill you. So not knowing your axioms, not unearthing axioms for people, is a malicious practice. To not tell people the truth with pungency and force, but in a way in which they have to grasp it themselves. So you can't do it didactically. To not do that, that is malicious. We cannot allow that. So we have to have the idea that when we are going out now in the present circumstance that we're in, and we're fighting, and we're hearing Trump being attacked in these various ways by people that haven't even begun to think about what he said, it's our job to bring a metaphor to them. And the metaphor is, aren't you the President of the United States? They will look at you in great bafflement. You say, well, according to the Constitution of the United States and the principle of the general welfare and the principle of the executive branch, all citizens of the United States are required to think as though they are the same as the executive. That's exactly the reason that you have a single individual. That's why you don't want a parliamentary system. So that each individual in the population is required to think of himself or herself as being responsible to the nation as a whole, as exhibited in the behavior of the presidency of the United States. Not necessarily the particular individual, but as in the presidency of the United States. And when you hear the presidency speak, whatever you think about the president, however you felt about him, it is not only your duty, but it is your very substance of existence to respond to that. Otherwise, you are a subject. You are a slave, and you are not deserving of the name American, because that's all American means. It is a commitment to the imagination of the human race deployed by means of a constitutional republic to change the world with the collaboration of many, many other people and many, many other nations. And to make that change a positive change that increases the ability of human beings to do the same thing better than you did. That this is the topic that Lynn's concern of the issue of metaphor was intended for people to concentrate on. And as I said, we've only touched on a couple of paragraphs of it. And I encourage you, in fact, I implore you, to take a look at this document, start reading it, and start thinking about how you can come to understand what it says.